Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program on February 24th, 2023. Good morning. Welcome to the second program of our 2023 schedule. I'm Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods. Thank you for making time in your day to learn perhaps something new about the Civil War. Before we hear from our speaker, I'd like to cover a few things. First, let me ask members of our Civil War Study Group board to stand so that you can see who they are. And the gentleman closing the door also is on the board. And at any rate, as I've mentioned before, a group like this needs fresh input on a regular basis. So now that you've seen these folks, if you happen upon them in your travels around Lake of the Woods and you have an idea for either a speaker or for an activity, buttonhole them and share it with us, okay? Because we do listen. Our next program will be our annual dinner in this space on Friday, March 24th, starting at 5:30 p.m. for a social hour. Seats are filling up fast, however, they're still available. So if you haven't yet done so, please visit our website, civilwarstudygroup.org, and there's a link to the form that you can fill out. We need to receive your reservations and checks by February 10th. February 17th. So March. Did I say? Oh, pardon, March. So you're already late. My apologies. March 17th, a week before the event, and in any event. So, our speaker today is Kevin Pollack. Did I pronounce that right?
Pollack.
Pollack?
Yeah, I'll take either way.
Okay. Kevin is a historic site manager for the Prince William County Historic Preservation Division and works as a licensed battlefield guide at Antietam National Battlefield. Kevin also sits on the board of directors of the Shepherdstown Battlefield Preservation Association and the Save Historic Antietam Foundation. Busy guy. Previously, Kevin has worked or completed internships at Harper's Ferry National Historical Park, the Papers of Abraham Lincoln at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and the Mosby Heritage Area Association. Kevin is the author of Shepherdstown in the Civil War, One Vast Confederate Hospital, published by the History Press in 2015. And I just want to point out to you that there is one last copy that is available at the end of the program today. And fortunately for you, Bob Stone already has his copy, so you won't have in this competition. Kevin is also author of To Hazard All, a Guide to the Maryland Campaign, which sort of dovetails in with his subject today. He has also authored The Heaviest Blow Yet Given the Confederacy, The Emancipation Proclamation Changes the Civil War, in Turning Points of the Civil War, which is part of the emerging Civil War series of books that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That's an interesting subject, which I promise will get Kevin invited back for the 2024 program season. But enough about from me. Please welcome our speaker, Kevin Pollack.
You can hear me all right? All right, I promise that if you can't hear me, I used to, of course, work at Harper's Ferry and always had to compete with trains on a nonstop basis. So I do at my current job as well at Bristow Station. So I can yell even louder if I need to, but if you need to turn me down too, that's okay. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invite to speak to you this morning. I am a morning person, and so it is great to be able to talk about the Civil War in the morning. Most Civil War roundtable groups and other groups that I talk with, of course, meet at night, so I'll be have extra energy, I guess, here in the morning talking about one of my favorite topics, not just the Maryland campaign itself, but sort of what we think of as the aftermath of not just the Maryland campaign, but the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam as well. And when we think about the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam, you probably have pictures that have already come into your mind of what that looks like, thanks to Alexander Gardner and Timothy Gibson, two photographers working for Matthew Brady's studio in Washington, D.C. that came out from the nation's capital to the Antietam battlefield. They probably arrived the day of the battle itself, began photographing scenes around the battlefield the next day, and then got onto the battlefield proper on September 19th, 2 days following the bloodiest single day in American military history, and they began to photograph and document for posterity what they saw. Of course, this is just one of many images that they recorded while they're on the Antietam battlefield. As you can see, before most of the dead were buried, in this case many of the Confederate dead, actually almost all of their images show Confederate dead as compared to Union dead, because of course the Union forces held onto the field and they buried their own dead first. There are a few exceptions to that rule. But this shows dead Louisiana soldiers along the Hagerstown Pike, a few hundred yards north of the famous Dunker Church. And I think what's quite interesting about this is for the past 160 years, this has been viewed as Antietam's aftermath. The photographs, the Emancipation Proclamation, the effects of 23,000 casualties and every single building becoming a hospital in the surrounding countryside, and the effects that that had on civilians. But I think what's so interesting is as we think about the Battle of Antietam and we think about the end of the Maryland campaign, again, this is what we're drawn to. But what's quite interesting about this photograph is that while Alexander Gardner was propping up his camera on a tripod along the Hagerstown Pike to photograph these dead Confederate soldiers, there were still echoes of cannon fire just a few miles in the distance, indicating that the outcome of the Maryland campaign had not yet been decided. But for so long, if you read general histories of the American Civil War, and even some more detailed histories of the war, which I'm sure you all have, and especially of the Maryland campaign, so often the story has been portrayed that the armies fight in this gigantic, titanic clash on the fields around Sharpsburg, Maryland on September 17th of 1862. The armies stare at each other the next day, and then Confederate Army Commander Robert E. Lee pulled his command back across the Potomac River into Virginia, it's now West Virginia, and the campaign came to an end. In reality, that could not be any further from the truth. So what I'm going to do today is share with you the last 3 days of the Maryland campaign, and hopefully give you a sense of just how much still hung in the balance following the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam itself. So we're going to pick up right on the night of September 17th with these two men that I'm sure are well known to all of you. Of course, on the left is Army of Northern Virginia Commander Robert E. Lee. On the right, his counterpart, Army of the Potomac Commander George McClellan. Lee, the night of September 17th, gathered his officers together, his immediate subordinate officers, at his headquarters in a small grove of trees that you can still visit today that's owned by the National Park Service, just a few miles, or less than a mile really, west of the town of Sharpsburg. And Lee gathered his subordinate officers together, not really to get much information from them. Lee was pretty active on the battlefield on the 17th and was pretty well aware of the state of his army at this point. But he had his officers report nonetheless, confirm what he already knew, that his army was in pretty rough shape, that it had lost some ground, in the case of just a few hundred yards mostly, on the northern end of the battlefield. And then Robert E. Lee turned to them, informed them to bring up the stragglers of their command, get any of the walking wounded back into their lines, and that the army would not withdraw across the Potomac River a few miles to their rear that night. Instead, they would stay. Now, this has often been portrayed as a defiant stand from Robert E. Lee, that he could read the minds of his opponent, in this case McClellan, and he knew that McClellan would not attack him the next day, and that Lee would be secure in his lines. In reality, looking at things from a more practical standpoint, Lee probably just simply realized that gathering up an army of over 30,000 soldiers and close to 7,000 or 8,000 wounded, getting them organized, getting them across the Potomac River before sunup the next morning was just not going to happen. And so Lee had to wait. He had no other option. And really, the last thing that Robert E. Lee wanted to do in the Maryland campaign was leave Maryland. He came to Maryland to fight a battle, he came to Maryland to win a battle, and he had not done that yet by the night of September 17th. Now for George McClellan, on the other side of things, McClellan did not meet with all of his immediate subordinate officers that night. He did meet with a few of them and certainly was around the field enough and had communicated with his subordinate officers enough to get a sense of where things were from the Army of the Potomac's perspective. Again, they had occupied some of the Confederate lines, had driven back some of the Confederate lines, just a few hundred yards. But McClellan was confident that the next day the battle would renew. And he was confident that he would be the one to renew that battle the next day. Soldiers were marching from Frederick, Maryland to join his army under the command of Andrew Humphreys. McClellan had also not had all of his forces immediately used as offensive troops on the battlefield on the 17th as well, and so he began preparations to attack at daylight of the next day, September 18th, if Lee's army was still going to be there. And of course, as you know, as I just told you, Lee's army is still there on the morning of September 18th. So here is the situation. The map is from, I was looking at this map again this morning, and I just noticed this. This comes from the United States Army, but it says 1861. It should be 1862 on the bottom there. But nonetheless, this is a map of the end of the Battle of Antietam, just to show you how little attention has been paid to the aftermath of Antietam. I can't find a map for September 18th, so I had to use the end of September 17th. But I think it draws a pretty good line of where the two armies were come the morning of September 18th. Of course, you have the town of Sharpsburg here. Antietam Creek weaves its way through the middle of the map itself. Some of the more famous landmarks that you might be familiar with, might have even visited, the Dunker Church is positioned here, the cornfield here, the West Woods in this area. So you can see the red line, of course, is the Confederate line. The blue lines will be Union troop positions. And one thing that's interesting to note, if I had shown you a before September 17th map, or the morning of September 17th, the Union Army controlled all 5 crossings of Antietam Creek at this point. So the Union Army is entirely across the creek. So Robert E. Lee no longer had that barrier between himself and the enemy that he so much liked. But nonetheless, Lee was a man that always looked for opportunity. And he was somebody that was always trying to take the initiative back if he had lost it, which in this case he had. He always wanted the Union Army to dance to his tune. Well, September 18th, the Union Army is not dancing to his tune. Lee is dancing to the Union Army's tune, because Lee is left with very few options about what to do. He could remain on the battlefield on September 18th and try to fend off more Union assaults, should they come his way. He could potentially try and attack the Union Army, though at this point, Lee's command is whittled down to about 30,000 soldiers, whereas he's facing over 60,000 Federals opposite him. And also, one last option is Lee could just take his army back across the Potomac River. But again, that's the last thing Lee wanted to do. So that morning, he consulted with Stonewall Jackson, who was commanding the northern end, or the left end, of Lee's line in the area of the West Woods. And Lee ordered Jackson to look for an opportunity to strike the Federal right, again on the northern end of the battlefield here. Jackson did not think it could be done. He was skeptical that any Confederate attack might be able to drive Federal troops back and open up perhaps an opportunity for Lee to move north in the direction of Hagerstown. But Robert E. Lee wanted Jackson to get a second opinion. So the very secretive Jackson turned to Stephen Lee, an artillerist in the Army of Northern Virginia, just a colonel, and told Lee to ride with him. Didn't tell Lee where he was going, what the purpose of the ride was, nothing like that. So they rode in silence all the way to the northern end of the battlefield, to a piece of high ground known as Nicodemus Heights that's generally in this area. They got off their horses at the bottom of the heights, crawled up on their hands and knees to the very top, pulled out their binoculars, and began surveying the Union lines. And Jackson finally turned to Lee, and he said, "Colonel Lee, I want you to take 50 guns and crush the Federal right." Lee realized now what the purpose of this whole ride was, pulled out his binoculars, probably took a deep breath, looked at the Union lines, and realized it couldn't be done. But he didn't want to say that to Jackson. And so he turned to Jackson and he said, "Well, sir, I'm not sure where I'm going to get the 50 guns." And Jackson said, "Don't worry about that. I will get you the guns. With 50 guns, can you crush the Federal right?" Lee takes another deep breath, looks in his binoculars again, surveys the strength of the Federal right, which included over 50 artillery pieces aiming right at them. Lee once again turned to Jackson and said, "I just don't know where I'm going to get the guns." Jackson replied back, "Don't worry about that. We'll get you the guns." And finally, Lee, after surveying the lines a little bit more, with Jackson watching him silently, turned to Jackson once again, and he said, "Sir, I think what you're doing is you really want my opinion." And Jackson says, "Yeah, that's exactly what I want." Of course, without having told Lee that that's what he wanted. And Lee simply turned to Jackson. He said, "Sir, I do not believe it can be done." Jackson replied, "Well, that is enough then." And the two of them walked back down from the heights of Nicodemus farm. They mounted their horses, and on the way back, Jackson gave Colonel Lee the job of telling the commanding general of the army that this could not be done. So Stephen Lee rode back to Robert E. Lee's headquarters, told Lee that he did not believe that the Federal right could be driven back. And Stephen Lee recorded years later, he said a shade came over the general's face. Because now at this point, Lee realized he had only one option left to him, and that was to leave Maryland and go back into Virginia. Now fortunately for Robert Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee could do that relatively unharassed because there was no federal attack made on September 18th. That's not to say there were no shots fired that day. There was some pretty heavy skirmishing, especially on the south end of the battlefield. More soldiers died. Soldiers were wounded. One soldier reported he fired over 100 shots from his rifle on September 18th. So some pretty serious skirmishing that was going on, but ultimately no large attack was made by George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac that day. There are many reasons for this. We don't have time to get into quite all of them, but McClellan believed he had done enough to confirm or at least achieve his objective in the campaign, which was simply to get Lee out of Maryland. McClellan felt he had done that on September 17th, that he had put Lee in a no-win situation, and that Lee would have nowhere else to go besides leave Maryland and get out of Maryland and get back to Virginia. Also, when thinking about the casualties of both armies, Lee's army suffered about 10,500 casualties on September 17th. That was about 28% of his strength that day. McClellan's army suffered more casualties numerically, about 12,500, only about 22% of his army, but still very heavy losses for both sides. Both sides had also suffered losses not just at the lower private soldier level, but also at the high command level. McClellan had lost 3 corps commanders within the last 3 days. Lee lost 3 of his 9 division commanders, and from there on down, the command levels of both armies was just shredded. Also, one thing you need to fight a battle with, most importantly, is bullets and shells and gunpowder. McClellan had over 40 large artillery pieces posted on the east side of Antietam Creek. They could control the entire battlefield, and they were out of ammunition. At 1:20 p.m. on September 17th, even in the midst of the battle being fought, McClellan wrote back to Henry Halleck back in Washington saying they needed more ammunition. A rush operation came through at the Washington Arsenal. Over 38 tons of ammunition was loaded onto train cars in Washington, D.C. That train left Washington the night of September 17th. It passed through Baltimore, York, Pennsylvania, all the way up to Harrisburg, and then down through Chambersburg to Hagerstown, about 12 miles north of the Antietam battlefield. Trains hardly moved. They could move, but they hardly moved at more than 12 or 15 miles an hour in 1862. Most accounts say this train was averaging over 55 miles an hour on its way to Hagerstown. It arrived that morning in Hagerstown, 12 miles north of the battlefield. But you'll notice that red line stops at Hagerstown. There is a rail connection today from Hagerstown to Sharpsburg, but it did not exist in 1862. So all of that ammunition, 38 tons, 2,500 rounds of ammunition, had to be offloaded of those rail cars, put into wagons, driven down to the Antietam battlefield, and then from there dispersed to those different batteries. By the time that was done, the sun had set on September 18th, and McClellan pushed his attack off for the next morning. When his troops rolled forward, the morning of September 19th, they found the Confederate positions around Sharpsburg vacated. The Confederate army was gone, having left in the middle of the night to cross the Potomac River back into Virginia. And there's where the story typically comes to an end. However, in Robert E. Lee's mind, this was not the end. Instead, this was just a changing of plans. McClellan had put him in a no-win situation, had boxed him in between Antietam Creek and the bends of the Potomac River. Lee had to change his plans. He was going to leave Maryland, but he would not be gone for too long. The night of September 18th, Lee began pulling as much of his forces back as he possibly could, leaving behind some of the wounded who could not be transported in ambulances. But Lee came up with a plan that has since gone down to be known as the Williamsport Plan. Because up the Potomac River, here is Sharpsburg, of course, here is Shepherdstown. The Potomac River is not blue in this map, unfortunately, but it kind of weaves its way through the middle of the map. Here is Williamsport. That was going to be Lee's re-entry point into Maryland. In order to secure that, he tasked Jeb Stuart with his cavalry to make a lightning dash up the west side of the Potomac River, recross the river later the morning of September 19th, establish a bridgehead at Williamsport, and make a demonstration in the direction of Hagerstown, a nice crossroads town. Once Stuart had established the bridgehead, Lee's infantry would follow behind, taking a bit of a longer route. Where is the infantry? There they are. They're a little slow moving this morning. They will cross the Potomac River about a mile downstream from Shepherdstown, swing west towards Martinsburg, take the Valley Pike in the direction of Williamsport. With Stuart's bridgehead having been established, they will cross at Williamsport and move on Hagerstown. Lee hoped that by September 20th, his army would be in position to have recrossed back into Maryland, moved towards Hagerstown, and Lee hoped he might give the Federal Army the slip here, that they would be surprised by what Lee was doing and would not react in time. Once Lee got to Hagerstown, three options presented themselves to him. He could either move south and strike the Army of the Potomac in the area around Sharpsburg, or perhaps on the move. Lee could also move east from Hagerstown and threaten Baltimore and Washington, or he could move north from Hagerstown into Pennsylvania. Lee was somebody that liked having options. Options were a good thing. So, this is Lee's plan. Now, as we all know, you can have the greatest plans in the world, but they're going to fall apart pretty quickly once your enemy decides to do something. Now, Lee, remember, his focus is on Williamsport. Here, not back here. So, that morning, throughout the night of September 18th into the morning of the 19th, Lee left a small force of a few hundred cavalry, 600 infantry, and 44 artillery pieces back at Butler's Ford, a mile downstream from Shepherdstown, all under the command of his artillery chief, William Nelson Pendleton. Pendleton was a West Pointer, but he had resigned from the Army the year after graduating. He had run several different Episcopal parishes into the ground prior to the American Civil War. Pendleton did have friends in high places, though. He graduated from West Point the same year as Jefferson Davis. He's a good person to know in the Confederacy. And, of course, would have graduated the year after Robert E. Lee as well. Pendleton, however, was not viewed very highly by this point. During the Confederate Army's reorganization in the midst of the 7 Days battles in June and early July of 1862, Pendleton was in charge and direct control of not only just all the Army's artillery, but he personally was directly in charge of 27 artillery batteries. By the time of the Maryland campaign, he's in charge of 4. Pendleton's influence is starting to go down quite a bit in the Army of Northern Virginia. In fact, one of Pendleton's soldiers had this to say about Pendleton. He said, "Pendleton is Lee's weakness. We have him, and we don't know what on earth to do with him, and it costs a devil of a sight to feed him." So, not very highly thought of within the Army of Northern Virginia. But nonetheless, Pendleton is tasked with holding on to the riverbank. And he's given very specific, explicit orders by Army headquarters. And those orders say, hold out throughout the day of September 19th. If it's only Federal artillery that comes and bombards you on the north bank of the river, wait until nightfall, and then pull back and rejoin the rest of the Army. If, however, there is Federal infantry, try to pull back sooner and join the rest of the Army. By this point, Lee's not going to be too concerned about what's going on behind him because, again, his focus is all at Williamsport. Pendleton, to his credit, arrayed his guns quite well around Butler's Ford, that crossing a mile downstream from Shepherdstown, on the bluffs on the south bank of the river. About 10 a.m., the first Federals to pursue Lee's Army of Northern Virginia arrived on the bluffs on the north side of the river. This was the horse artillery under the command of McClellan's cavalry commander, Alfred Pleasanton. Pleasanton deployed 3 batteries. They began shooting back and forth across the Potomac River. Pendleton's orders were not to cross the river unless he saw an opportunity to do extensive damage to the Confederate Army without inflicting much damage on his own command. Initially, there was no opportunity for Pleasanton to do that because the Confederate gunners were bombarding and zeroing in on Pleasanton's guns. So, Pleasanton wrote back to McClellan's headquarters asking for help, asking for more strength to his pursuit back towards the Potomac River. Initially, McClellan would send the Union 6th Corps, but almost as soon as he sent William Franklin's 6th Corps, we'll talk more about them in a bit, McClellan received word from Williamsport upstream that Confederates had crossed up there. So McClellan turned the 6th Corps around, began marching them north towards Williamsport, and in its place, he sent Fitzjohn Porter's 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac to the riverbank. When Porter arrived, he told Pleasanton and his gunners that they were no longer needed. They could go back to their camps in the rear. Pleasanton did not like that, but nonetheless, that's what he did. And soon enough, Porter was operating under the same orders that Pleasanton had been operating under, not to advance across the river unless he saw an opportunity to do damage to the Confederate rear guard. Well, throughout the afternoon, Porter was dispatching more and more Federal artillery pieces to the north bank of the river, you can see here, and also was dispatching some of his infantry down to the dry bank of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal running along the north bank of the Potomac River. Those infantrymen began to shoot at Pendleton's artillerists, Pendleton's infantry there as well, and the cavalry. Soon enough, though, Pendleton was experiencing a lot of issues. Firstly, he was now supremely outgunned by the Federals on the north bank of the river. One Confederate artillerist said that their guns were like pop guns compared to the Federal artillery. Also, Pendleton was starting to receive word that Federal troops were trying to cross further downstream. So what Pendleton ended up doing was dispersing his already small force away from Butler's Ford itself. And lastly, close to nightfall, Pendleton began receiving word that his artillery was out of ammunition. Remembering his explicit orders not to pull back until nightfall, Pendleton told his artillerists to hold out just a little longer. Rather than pulling their guns off, which could not shoot, off the bluff, he told them just stand there and wait, believing, he's not wrong about this, believing that by pulling those guns off, that might be an incentive to the Federals to come across. So Pendleton just told them to hunker down, wait until nightfall. Well, what he also didn't factor in is those guns not shooting became an incentive to the Federals to cross. And so, just at dusk, on the afternoon of September 19th, about 400 Federal infantrymen from the United States sharpshooters in the 4th Michigan charged across the Potomac River. There at Butler's Ford, the sharpshooters hit the ford directly. The 4th Michigan plunged into the river upstream from the ford and realized that they missed the ford when water ran up to their necks. But they nonetheless made it across, the entire command suffering just 7 casualties, and they began to scatter the Confederate rear guard. Pendleton, who was slightly behind the lines, began seeing his troops fleeing for the rear, and without doing anything to try and get his rear guard off the field in one piece, Pendleton left the field and began riding for the rear, looking for help. So, this brings us to my favorite slide of the entire presentation, the searching Pendleton, as I call it. Pendleton riding throughout the night looking for help. He found plenty of people to ask help of. He found Roger Pryor, who was now in command of Richard Anderson's division. Anderson had been wounded on September 17th. So Pendleton turned to Pryor and said, I need troops. Federal troops have crossed the Potomac River. Can you help me? And Pryor said, I don't have any orders to help you, so move on to the next guy. So Pendleton did. And he found John Bell Hood, of course, one of the best divisions in the Army of Northern Virginia. Asked Hood for help. And Hood pretty much told him the same exact thing. So Pendleton kept riding. He found Daniel Harvey Hill, eventually Osmond Latrobe down there in the bottom right, staff officer on David R. Jones's division. Both Hill and Latrobe said the same thing. And finally, about midnight or shortly thereafter, Pendleton stumbled on the headquarters of Stonewall Jackson. Pendleton told Jackson the situation, as he knew it, at the ford. Of course, Jackson was one to not ignore an opportunity to potentially attack those Federal troops. and Jackson began immediately making preparations to return to the river. Before Pendleton left him, though, Pendleton asked where the commanding general could be found. It just so worked out that Jackson and Lee were camped close to each other. And so Pendleton went and found Robert E. Lee at his tent. Now, by this point, it's close to 1 a.m., the morning of September 20th. This is perhaps the first night in almost a week that Lee has gotten more than a few hours of consecutive sleep. At 1 a.m., here comes William Nelson Pendleton up to Lee's tent. Knocks on Lee's tent pole, the staff officer goes in, informs Lee that Pendleton is here to see him. Lee wakes up, stumbles outside of his tent, and Pendleton informs the Army commander that all 44 guns of his rear guard have just been captured. Lee, as you might imagine, woke up pretty quickly at that remark and was in disbelief and could simply stammer all. And Pendleton replied, "Yes, General, I fear all." Lee said, "Well, there's no more that can be done about this at the moment." And Pendleton went to find a straw rick to lay down and get a few hours of rest. Lee now had a serious problem. Not where his focus was, at Williamsport, but instead behind him, now at Shepherdstown. And what Pendleton's intelligence told Lee was that this was a large federal force. To have captured all 44 guns of the artillery reserve, Lee now had to put the brakes on his Williamsport plan and turn his army around to go back toward Shepherdstown to deal with the federal threat in his rear. Now, in reality, Pendleton did not lose 44 guns. He lost 4 guns. But he had left the field and was unaware of the heroic efforts of some of his subordinate officers to get the rest of the artillery rear guard off the field. Of those 4 guns, the Federals brought a couple of them over the river the night of September 19th, and then Federal troops returned early the morning of the 20th to grab the other 2. Now, the charge across the river that night, the night of the 19th, those soldiers were under the command of Charles Griffin, who you see here on the left-hand side of the screen. Griffin was an artillerist at heart. He had commanded an artillery battery atop Henry Hill, the Battle of First Manassas. Most of his guns had been lost there at that battle. And as soldiers of the 62nd Pennsylvania Infantry brought one of those captured Confederate artillery pieces back across to the north bank of the Potomac River, Griffin all of a sudden became ecstatic. If you know anything about Charles Griffin, he was perhaps in the top 3 of some of the best swearers in the Army at the moment. But at this point, you couldn't get him to shut up for weeks on end because he recognized one of those guns that had been captured from Pendleton's rear guard as one of his own guns that had been lost under his command at the Battle of First Manassas in July 1861. And the cool thing is, going through Henry Hunt's papers in the Library of Congress, just to show how novel of a thing this was, this document here that you see on the right is in Henry Hunt's papers, and it records every little bit of detail about that gun, which I think is so cool. So you can see what's marked on the right trunnion and the left trunnion, and it even gives the gun number, and it says, there's a bullet hole through one of the spokes of the wheel. Really cool information. And so me, having nothing else to do with my life besides research history, thought, how cool would it be to find this gun? It's got to be out there somewhere, right? So I set it aside for a while, didn't know where to look, and one day while I was at school, a friend of mine who, just go to the library and hang out and read Civil War books, found this really cool, large, oversized book. It's Artillery in the Civil War. It says, look in the back, there's a roster or a catalog of every single gun that we know of and where it is from the Civil War. So immediately, where did I turn to? Looking for Model 1861 Barrett rifles. And it turns out gun number 2 was as part of a Civil War monument in a small town in western New York called Avon, New York, which is only about 30 minutes from where I grew up. So, here is the gun itself. You can see it has the number 2 marking on the face of the muzzle. There is the right trunnion with RPP, Robert Parrott's initials, and WPF, West Point Foundry, 1861. This is gun number 2. still there today. If any of you would like to join me every time I give these talks, I haven't rallied a large enough crowd yet, but I'm going to drive up to Avon and bring it back down here. One of these days it's going to happen. Now, the really cool thing about this gun is I have not been able to prove this with 100% certainty, but that gun was put back into Battery D of the 5th U.S. Artillery, which is Griffin's original battery. Where is that gun? Where's that battery, I should say? On July 2nd, 1863, it's right on top of Little Round Top. The Model 1863 parrots, this is really getting in the weeds, but the Model 1863 parrots were not delivered to the Army of the Potomac until the fall of 1863. So I can almost with 100% certainty prove that this gun was atop Henry Hill. It was captured by Confederate troops, recycled through several Confederate batteries, recaptured by Griffin on September 20th, 1862, put back in Battery D, and it was there atop Little Round Top on July 2nd, 1863. Pretty darn cool. That's my geek out for the morning. Like I said, I'm a morning person. I don't even drink coffee, but this is just great stuff. All right, so for the Federals that day, Fitzjohn Porter is now in charge, again, commanding the Union 5th Corps. And Porter's orders the previous night were, again, do not go across the Potomac River unless you see an opportunity to do damage to the Confederates without inflicting so much damage on yourself. Well, he did that, only 7 casualties, captured 4 guns. Great. He also managed to capture a few Confederate prisoners. And what one of them told him was the Confederate Army was in really bad shape. That General Lee was wounded, General Longstreet was wounded. Things are not looking good for the Army of Northern Virginia on the south bank of the Potomac. So what Porter decided to do, he wrote to McClellan asking permission. I've never found any response from McClellan that he wrote back. But what Porter wanted to do the next morning was stage a reconnaissance in force across the river and figure out where the Confederate Army was and what state it was in. McClellan, again, either he approved it or just didn't say anything, and Porter did it anyway. But by that morning, Fitzjohn Porter began moving his infantry down to Butler's Ford to bring them across the Potomac River. However, if you think about the structure of a Civil War army, what's one thing you want in front of your infantry if you are looking for information? What's the eyes and ears of the army?
Cavalry.
The cavalry, right? Very good. Okay. Well, 7 a.m. ticks by, 8 a.m. ticks by, no cavalry down at the ford. Where are they? Remember the previous night when Porter showed up on the north bank of the Potomac River, he told Pleasanton, go back to your camps. Pleasanton's camps were east of the Antietam battlefield, so about 4 or 5 miles in rear of Porter's corps at this point. Pleasanton and his cavalry on their way back to their camps were going in this direction. Their wagons full of food and fodder for the horses were going in this direction. They passed like ships in the night. Pleasanton got off to a very late start because of that, and his cavalry did not show up at Butler's Ford until things were too well out of hand for the Federal troops. So the infantry was going in alone. Now what Porter decided to do was to send 2 infantry brigades across the river, about 3,000 men overall. The first, and ultimately this whole operation on the south side of the river, was under the command of George Sykes. 1 brigade of Sykes' division, under the command of Charles Lovell, a brigade of United States Regulars, would move south along what is today known as the Trough Road. Back then, at the time of the battle, it was known as the Charlestown Road. Figure out where the Confederates were in that direction. Once Lovell's brigade had crossed the river, a 2nd Union brigade, part of George Morrell's division, would cross, and they would proceed west from the ford up the river road in the direction of Shepherdstown. That would be James Barnes's brigade, soldiers from New York, Massachusetts, Maine, and Pennsylvania. That's the plan. 2-pronged approach, figure out where the Confederates are, don't become entangled in a battle, because now these troops have a river to their rear. And not only a river that is overlooked by 70, 80, 90-foot bluffs. Not a great place to be fighting a battle. So, find out where the Confederates are, and then fall back. Lovell's brigade, as it moves south from the Potomac River, moved about 3/4 to a mile south of the river. They fanned out into their skirmish lines. And suddenly a Union skirmisher saw 1 man on horseback darting out in front of the skirmish line. And soon enough, following that 1 man on horseback, came skirmishers of Confederate infantry. The Federals had found them, and George Sykes, recognizing that the south side of the Potomac River was no place to fight a battle, began pulling his troops back to the river. Now, in the meantime, in order to cover for Lovell's withdrawal back towards the river, Sykes sent orders to James Barnes to stop his movement west toward Shepherdstown and to put his men on the bluffs here, west of the Charlestown Road, to cover Lovell's withdrawal back towards the river. This is going to be a simple, we'll protect you as you fall back across the river. Well, unfortunately for Lovell's brigade, and then soon to be Barnes's brigade, the Confederates that were driving them back towards the river were perhaps some of the best Confederate troops in the entire Army of Northern Virginia. They were the Light Division under the command of A.P. Hill. About 3,000 men at this point that were the vanguard of Lee's army as Lee had turned his army around to move it back towards Shepherdstown to deal with this threat in his rear. Remember, Lee doesn't know he's only lost 4 guns. Lee knows he's lost all 44 guns. This has to be a large force. So, Hill's division is just the tip of the spear for the Army of Northern Virginia. Hill formed his 6 brigades up into 2 lines, like you see arrayed here on the map, and they began driving south, pushing Lovell's brigade back towards the river. They didn't have to push too hard because Lovell's men are already falling back towards the river. Suddenly, the rest of Lovell's brigade, the rest of Barnes's brigade, deployed on the bluffs south of the river itself to cover for Lovell's brigade and another brigade that had crossed. Basically, they crossed, they deployed, and then they turned around and went back because they're not meant to stay. You can see a 4th brigade was actually started. This would have been Thomas Stockton's brigade. In his brigade was the 20th Maine Infantry. Lieutenant Colonel is, of course, Joshua Chamberlain. Chamberlain, thinking he might go into battle that day, decided he didn't want to ride his own horse because he didn't want it to be shot, so he borrowed somebody else's horse. And as he was riding through the river, a bullet struck that horse that he was riding on, dunked Chamberlain into the river itself, and that truly was Joshua Chamberlain's baptism of fire on September 20th at Shepherdstown. But they immediately U-turned and turned around. Okay, so Barnes's brigade is the only one that's left now. You can see their deployment, again, Maine, Massachusetts, I forgot Michigan, sorry if anybody's from Michigan. Pennsylvania and New York troops. There, it was a pretty uneven deployment, simply because the terrain there did not allow all these regiments to connect as much as it might look like they did on the map. Walking the ground, there was just no way that they could have. Barnes's brigade was an excellent brigade in the Union Army's 5th Corps. It was about 1,700 men overall. All of the units, with one exception, had been in multiple engagements before. These were veteran troops. They had just been supplemented at the start of the Maryland campaign by a brand new regiment, the 118th Pennsylvania. Big ones here in the middle. These troops have been in the Army for 3 weeks. Literally, they've never fired their guns before. The maneuver that they used to deploy into their line of battle on the battlefield, the first time they ever did it as an entire regiment of 700 plus men was the day before this. These guys are brand new. And the brigade, as I mentioned, is 1,700 men. 700 plus come from one regiment. Goes to show you all the casualties that these other units suffer. So, they start to feel the pressure from Pender's brigade of North Carolinians, part of Hill's division at front line, that you can see there. And immediately, having realized that Lovell's brigade has pulled back, James Barnes is now ready to issue orders for his own brigade to pull back across the river. So Barnes says to one of his staff officers, Walter Davis, he says, I'll let the 2nd Maine, the 18th Mass, 1st Michigan, and the 22nd Massachusetts know that it's time to pull back. Turns to Walter Davis and says, go tell the units on the right end of the line it's time to leave. So, Barnes gets these 4 units, Davis gets the 25th and 13th New York, tells them it's time to pull back, and as he's working his way back east towards the crossing point, he sees, just deploying into their line of battle and starting to open fire on Pender's North Carolinians, the 118th Pennsylvania. They're not supposed to be doing that. But there was some miscommunication between Davis and Barnes about who was going to let the Pennsylvanians know what was going on. So Davis yelled up one of the ravines to a lieutenant of the 118th Pennsylvania, Barnes's orders. It's time to pull back, disengage from the enemy, and get back across the river. So Davis yells this to this lieutenant. Davis goes riding off to the ford to tell Barnes everybody's okay, got all the orders, fine. This lieutenant makes his way to the center of the 118th Pennsylvania's battle line, there we go, and finds this man, Charles Prevost, who is the colonel of the 118th Pennsylvania. Prevost had been a staff officer in the Pennsylvania militia prior to the war. He had seen some service in the Civil War, but not really any hard battle service, just campaigning. But Prevost is leading the 118th Pennsylvania. He gets this word from one of his lieutenants that there are orders from Colonel Barnes to pull his men back across the river. And Prevost replied, "From whom did you hear these orders?" He says, "One of Colonel Barnes' aides." And Prevost turned back to his lieutenant and he said, "We don't receive orders that way. If Colonel Barnes wants us to pull back, he can tell us himself." Now this may seem like a very stupid thing to say. Maybe it was for Prevost to say, but remember, he's not all that familiar with Barnes' brigade, with how Barnes operates. It's their first battle. Do you want to be the guys that pull back when everybody else stayed? Because they can't really see everybody else leaving at this point because of the way the terrain is. So the 118th Pennsylvania remained. They began to open fire on the North Carolinians in front of them and realized pretty quickly they had more problems than just Confederate troops shooting at them, because by some estimates as high as 50% of their rifles were malfunctioning and did not shoot. Now, I think it's probably more in the realm of 25% or so. I think a lot of the problems as to why the Pennsylvanians' guns did not work is not just because of faulty manufacturing, but because of faulty loading. These soldiers they've never fired their guns. They've never done it, certainly. They've never loaded their guns. Certainly not under fire while they're doing this. And one of the Pennsylvania officers later wrote that a lot of these guys, they were putting their bullets in backwards. They were putting in bullets in before the powder. And there's bullets hissing by their head. They don't recognize that their guns are not going off until they're trying to ram the ramrod down, and a bullet won't even go down the barrel because it's filled up with bullets and gunpowder. So the Pennsylvanians are having a problem. Now they're also the only unit up there. And so they are the center of attention for A.P. Hill's division. You can see Pender's brigade begins looping around its flanks, bending the 118th Pennsylvania back on itself. As it does that, the center of the line of those Pennsylvanians begins to think that because they see the troops on their left and right falling back, that's the order, that's what they've been given, that's what they've been told to fall back now. Well, they haven't been. And so Charles Prevost leapt up to the color guard of the 118th Pennsylvania, grabbed the national colors of that regiment, planted them in the ground, told his men to move up to that flag to rally there, when suddenly a bullet knocked Prevost out, hitting him in the chest. It embedded just centimeters from his vertebrae, and he was carried from the field, leaving command to Lieutenant Colonel James Gwynn. As Prevost was being carried down one of those ravines to the river road, he encountered Barnes. James Barnes asked him where his regiment was. Prevost replied, "Deployed on top of the bluff where you told them to go," and then he was passing out from loss of blood, and so he was carried to the north side of the river. This would be the last battlefield that Prevost saw during the course of the Civil War. That bullet was never removed from his body. Doctors feared it was too dangerous, getting too close to his backbone to remove that bullet. It remained in him until 1884 when he died. By this point, he had become fully blind and fully paralyzed from that wound that he suffered 22 years earlier. Now, James Gwynn sees the situation. He sees that what Prevost has just been trying to do, rallying his men. And so Gwynn is going to order the men of the 118th Pennsylvania to fix bayonets. He's going to order a charge into the teeth of Pender's North Carolinians. Just as he's about to do that, though, he gets word from Barnes, "Get out of here." And Gwynn starts ordering his men down off the bluff itself, back down one of those ravines. Now, as they do so, you can see that second line of Hill's division has lapped around the right flank of the 118th Pennsylvania. Those Pennsylvanians begin running down the bluff, looking for cover. At one point, one of the path that they had taken up was, at some point, Federal artillery from the north bank of the river had knocked down a tree and it had come crashing down over that pathway, so Pennsylvanians were trying to clamber over it, slowing them down, and of course that led to the deaths of many of those Pennsylvania soldiers as the rest of Hill's division began shooting down on them. The Pennsylvanians could not make it back to the ford, so instead they had to use the mill dam to get across the river itself. This is a picture taken after the war in the 1880s. This is looking from the north bank of the Potomac River, so this is the bluff. It was much more open at the time of the battle that the Pennsylvanians fought on. You can see just the start of one of these ravines that some of them jumped down to try and escape, and this is the remnants of the mill dam itself. Now, running across the mill dam, as you might imagine, was pretty dangerous because they're under fire the whole way as they are doing that. And so a few Pennsylvania soldiers leapt into some of the archways from the lime kilns of the cement mill to avoid being shot at by the Confederates behind them. Unfortunately, in one of those archways was crowded 9 men. One of the Federal artillery shells landed short inside of that archway, exploded, and claimed the lives of almost all 9 of those men. Thankfully, one of them that it did not claim was a private named Henry Smith, who eventually went on to become the historian of the 118th Pennsylvania and helped lead to the publication of the 118th Pennsylvania's regimental history, which I would say is one of the best that you can find of any Union regiment. Nonetheless, though, by this point now, the Pennsylvanians have been driven across the river. By 10 in the morning or so, Lee's rear has been secured. He has driven all those Federal troops across the river itself, and the fighting at Shepherdstown has come to an end. Lee, by turning his army around, has now secured the rear of his lines. However, remember, Lee's plan was not to march back towards Shepherdstown, it's to march up towards Williamsport. And so, come September 20th, Jeb Stuart has been making some noise, perhaps a little bit too much noise, in Williamsport, which has led to Federal forces reacting to his bridgehead there, which is 1 brigade of cavalry, over 1,000 cavalrymen, a few guns, and a couple hundred infantry. Not a very large force at all. But now it's going to take longer for Stuart to get that support there at Williamsport to keep that bridgehead going. I guess Jeb Stuart's ghost didn't like what I had to say about him. The lights flickering. But by this point also, George McClellan has not only reacted to pushing his men towards the Potomac River at Shepherdstown to pursue the Confederates in that direction, but he's also been pushing troops north towards Williamsport to encircle and ensnare Stuart's bridgehead at Williamsport and drive it back across the river. So those troops, those Union troops, came from 3 different divisions. The 4th Corps Division of Darius Couch, you see there in the middle. William Franklin's 6th Corps arrived as well, and also some of the Pennsylvania militia that was under the command of John Reynolds arrived in Hagerstown, cutting Stuart off from advancing towards Hagerstown, of establishing his objective. And of course, the ultimate weight of those Federal forces arrayed against Stuart convinced him that he could not maintain his bridgehead on the north bank of the river. And so the night of September 20th, he pulled his small command back to the south bank, back into Virginia. And the next morning, reported to Robert E. Lee that the bridgehead at Williamsport was no longer there. It was this realization, and also the realization that Lee had that in his army's movement back towards Shepherdstown, the wheels were simply falling off of the Army of Northern Virginia at this point. Lee's quest to try and get back into Maryland was not going to work. And as he wrote in his after-action report, there goes Stuart, driving down I-81 back towards Lansing. As Lee wrote to Jefferson Davis, one of only 3 times he mentioned his Williamsport plan in writing. You can see he said the march of the army toward Williamsport was arrested, was stopped. And as he wrote in his after-action report, love this, the condition of our troops now demanded repose. And the army marched to the Opequon near Martinsburg, where it remained for several days and then moved to the vicinity of Bunker Hill and Winchester. Lee was done campaigning with his army in Maryland for now. It was time, after months of marching and fighting almost non-stop, Lee realized his army needed to rest and recover and recuperate and get ready for the next campaign. On the north side of the Potomac River, George McClellan had much the same feelings. His army, remember, had been cobbled together. It was really 5 separate Federal armies that he had put together in a matter of just days, led out from behind the defenses of Washington to drive Lee out of Maryland and achieve the Federal objective in the campaign. The Federal Army was not as bad shape as Lee's army was, but it was certainly not the juggernaut army of the Potomac that is often portrayed in Civil War literature. And at this point, McClellan decided as well that it was time for his army to rest, recover, recuperate, reorganize it, and then get ready for one more campaign. That realization was not made on the banks of Antietam Creek on September 17th, but for both generals, it was made on the banks of the Potomac River at Shepherdstown on September 20th and September 21st. Thank you all very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes, sir.
Was Pinkerton involved with intel to McClellan during this battle?
Yes, he was. Pinkerton was there. McClellan was relying more on, there's a pretty robust spy network that the Federals had established in Maryland that they were using to get information about the Confederates. Also, McClellan's intel came from Henry Halleck, who was back in Washington, which is sort of odd, you might think, because of course McClellan is closer to the enemy than Halleck is, but Halleck is feeding him a lot of information. And so too is Governor Curtin, Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania. So that's where a lot of McClellan's information came from. Pinkerton's role in the Maryland campaign is a bit uncertain. He wrote about it in some of his memoirs of the war, but he was somebody that told a lot of tall tales and spun a lot of tall tales after the war. We do know for sure that Pinkerton, he was definitely there at Antietam, and he did actually go back. McClellan sent him back to Washington just a couple of days after to report back to Lincoln what the state of the Army was and what the Army had done at Antietam. So in most of these operations, Pinkerton wasn't there. In fact, most of the information that the Federals got at Shepherdstown and at Williamsport came from local civilians, slaves, and of course Confederate prisoners also. Any other questions at all? Yes, sir.
With the 118th Pennsylvania, was that same as Saunders Field, I believe.
I believe you are correct, yes. They did serve throughout the rest of the war.
And Chamberlain was there. I think they had the second, but it was on the thing. It should have been the 20th. On the,
No, so
I think that was a mistake.
the second main is correct.
Oh, it is?
Yes,
Oh,
yep.
But the 20th was Chamberlain.
Correct, yeah, so Chamberlain was in, they did the U-turn with Stockton's brigade. So they never even made it to the south bank of the river. Well, they did, and then they turned around and
Oh, that's what happened.
yeah, the second main are the ones, the movie Gettysburg, of course, they're the ones
My
that...
grand-
John, you have a question?
Oh, I was just gonna ask, how much of this is accessible today, preserved, or interpretive signs? What's the latest?
Yep.
We wanna see this.
So, let me go back to the bigger picture here. So, you can see the green on this map is the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park.
Right.
So you can still go down there, of course. They do own Ferry Hill, which was the home of Henry K. Douglas, who was on Stonewall Jackson's staff. That's where the battle started, at least where the Federal artillery initially deployed. And then there is one marker at the ford on the Maryland side. If you drive down through Shepherdstown, it's called East German Street, their main street. Down River Road, you'll come to the intersection of River Road and Trough Road. The remains of the cement mill are still there. There are a few War Department tablets that were put up in the 1890s that tell the story of the Battle of Shepherdstown. There's a Civil War Trail sign as well. So you can see that. Now, a lot of the battlefield is privately owned still. There is about 40 acres along the river, basically the cement mill property, that has been preserved by American Battlefield Trust and the Jefferson County Historic Landmarks Commission. But then also the ground that Hills Division advanced across, you can see this little loop here on the map. There is a wartime house there, the Osborne Farm. Shepherdstown Battlefield Preservation Association has fought it for 16 years. It was going to be turned into a housing development. Late last year, late 2022, right around the anniversary of the battle, the American Battlefield Trust purchased that ground for $2 million. So it's all now preserved. It's a little unsure what's going to happen to it in terms of, it's going to be preserved, we know that, but in terms of who's going to manage it afterwards. So all that's been preserved as well. So really the core of the battlefield is there. Preservation threats aren't over to it, but most of it is now preserved, thankfully.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Yes, a question. This one's very good, by the way. How wide and deep is the Potomac at Butler's Ford?
Yeah. So Butler's Ford is, of course, it always depends on what time of year you're crossing. I have crossed it before. It is about knee to waist deep most of the time. What's really cool about it, on that map, is you can see, this map shows it pretty well, it's not a straight line across. It is a big bend. And what's really cool following it is it's a big piece of sheetrock in the middle of the river that just curves like that. And that's right where the ford is. So the ford is actually pretty wide. It extends more downstream than it does upstream. That's why the 4th Michigan missed it and the sharpshooters did not. But it's pretty easily crossable there. They had been used since Native American times to cross. The river itself is about 300 yards wide or so at that point. So large enough to be certainly a large barrier, but the federal infantry in the canal could still shoot at Pendleton's guns, posted there on the bluff. Yeah, with rifles, of course, especially when you have the sharpshooters, they could still hit somebody at that point.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming today, but before you leave, John Canister has a few announcements to make. John was our presenter at our November meeting, and also subsequent to that meeting here in the clubhouse, he led a guided tour. John has a few minutes. Oh, by the way, book sales for Kevin are over here at the end.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Just some real fast local announcements. The Eastern National Bookstore in Fredericksburg manager Dean Colley approached me with doing some partnered battle anniversary events this year as far as author signing and tour events. And so we have a few of them coming up. For the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Chancellorsville, around April the 22nd, we're going to have author Michael Hardy of General Lee's Immortals come out for an author signing in the morning, and he's going to guide a bus tour. He wrote about Lane's Brigade, which is the brigade that was responsible for the Jackson wounding event there at Chancellorsville around the visitor center. If you want to get some good insight from Michael Hardy from North Carolina, that's going to be coming up. Real quick, for the Spotsylvania Courthouse anniversary, 159th anniversary, we're going to host author Bradley Godfrey, who has the Maps of series, who had the Maps of the Wilderness. He's come out with a brand new book on maps of Spotsylvania Courthouse through Cold Harbor. So we're looking at around May the 20th, Saturday, of Bradley Godfrey coming out for an author signing in the morning, and then a bus-led tour in the afternoon. And then last, real quick, the 160th anniversary of the beginning of the Gettysburg campaign is June the 3rd, and on that exact date, we're going to have an author signing tour event with Eric Wittenberg and Scott Mingus with their book, If We Are Striking for Pennsylvania. Real quick, the Gettysburg campaign did not start at Brandy Station. It started right here on the banks of the Rappahannock River. And we are going to strike for Pennsylvania from Fredericksburg beyond Brandy Station.
And you'll send us information so I can email it?
Yes, so this information is just going to be coming out because we had to get the blessing from the Park Service, which moves like a glacier speed. So this is really, you guys are one of the first ones to hear this. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.